This is episode 2 in my series of short videos on Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And in this short video I'm going to be talking about real versus imaginary experience and also the whole idea of relative suffering. I'm going to pull out a couple of quotes from the book which really struck me very, very deeply and really gave me good insight into those themes. So I'll just set the scene for the first quote. Frankl was on an overnight train going from one concentration camp to another, and he was in terrible circumstances, and he talks of this memory he had where he imagined his wife. And the quote is, "Real or not, her look was more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise." And it just had me thinking about the contrast between reality and imagined experience. So to me, in the past, I would have always thought that reality, that's the objective reality of life, is that which has that thing which has the greatest effect on me. And then kind of after years of learning about neuroscience and psychology and philosophy also, I realised, well, all I have is my mind, and although reality is external to me, I have to interpret it using my own mind. So my interpretation of things isn't necessarily objective reality. It's how I use my senses to navigate the world, how I integrate these senses to sort of generate some form of a narrative. And with that in mind, I used to get really frustrated with this idea of people describing things, it's only in your head. Well, everything in a sense is only in my head, as in it's only in my consciousness, if you want to locate consciousness in the brain. And just because something is only in my head doesn't make it any less consequential or any less important. And that really shines through in that quote. So again, I'll just relay it again. Real or not, her look was more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. Didn't matter that she actually wasn't in front of him, that she was not in front of him at that moment in time. She still made such a large impression on him that her image was much more important than anything that was around him. That mental image of his wife trumped everything in his environment, and it was much more important in those moments. And Viktor was in complete and utter desperate circumstances. But yet, another quote, he describes how he could still know bliss in the contemplation of my beloved. So despite the horrible reality of the situation he was in, he was experiencing pure bliss just by thinking of his wife. And I think there's great relevance of this idea to basically everybody, that no matter what your circumstances are, there can be worthwhile elements to it. That might sound a bit cliche. I hope I'll elaborate on that and it'll be a bit more convincing. So at this point in time, Viktor didn't even know if his wife was alive or not. And the point he was trying to communicate in these passages is that the fate of her existence, of her real existence, did not matter in those moments, because his love for her transcended any sort of ideas of mortality. His love for her was so strong that it didn't matter whether she was alive or not. If somebody went up to him and said, "Oh, your wife is dead," her death could not change the strength of that image in his mind in those moments, as reported by Viktor himself. So I think there's something really interesting to garner from that. So that's the whole idea of real versus imaginary experience. Now at this point, if I'd like to ask you, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the subscribe button. I'm hoping to hit 1,000 before the end of 2020 and have to start somewhere. So if you like it, please subscribe. Now I'm going to talk about relative suffering and the whole idea of how suffering can consume your life no matter what the circumstances are. Whether it be stressing about your college program, about school, about your job, about your relationships, or maybe you've experienced severe loss, maybe a family member has died, or maybe you've lost your job, or in even more dire circumstances, maybe you're in a concentration camp like the Uyghur Muslims in China at the moment, much like Frankl was during World War II. The depths of his suffering, environmentally speaking, are probably as deep as you can imagine. But he talked about the idea of how suffering is relative, and I love the analogy he gave. He said that suffering is like a gas in the space of the human soul. So let's imagine that the human soul occupies some form of space. Well, a gas is something that occupies the entire space it's in. It doesn't stay in one particular location, or doesn't keep one particular solid form like a solid would or like a liquid would. It will occupy the entire confines of its space. And that's exactly what happens when it comes to suffering. I've give a couple of examples of suffering I've had. Stressing about college. That consumed my mind, consumed what Frankl would say, my soul in those moments. There was nothing really else that mattered. Despite my circumstances not being that grave, I had shelter, I wasn't hungry, I was relatively financially stable, but yet this, one assignment was just consuming my mind. And kind of to keep that idea in mind, I think, is important, because considering suffering is relative, it can't really be eradicated from the perspective of Frankl anyway, in that no matter what your circumstances are, there will always be elements of suffering, but it's how that suffering is managed, or how that suffering is experienced, or potentially even championed. And he made the analogy that suffering is like death. They're inevitable. But it's something I thought kind of counterintuitive at first. He wanted to be worthy of his own suffering. And even still, it kind of gives me pause trying to figure out what that means. And he describes wanting to attain some sort of moral value from his suffering, some sort of utility in his suffering. He did that. He was a psychiatrist at the time, and he's become world renowned for his branch of psychotherapy called logotherapy, and his book Man's Search for Meaning has been incredibly influential worldwide and has helped many, many people. The value in his books and in his theories was largely informed, if not almost entirely informed, by his experiences during World War II, which were some of the gravest suffering experiences one could imagine, as I described earlier. And this idea of being worthy of your suffering, it alludes to another idea which I find very interesting. Sam Harris, who hosts the Making Sense podcast, often asks his guests to think of a negative experience which they would not like to repeat, but has profoundly changed them for the better. And I asked myself that question as well. What is something that I would never want to live through again, but I know, or I'm confident, it's had some sort of informative aspect to my life, or it's helped me grow, or it's helped me be who I am today or achieve the things I've achieved. And what comes to mind is my father dying in early childhood, and I don't need to elaborate on why I wouldn't like to repeat it. It was, incredibly traumatic, and even I harbour some of the kind of trauma of that experience to this day, and I still grieve for him. But that experience, it would be, I think, intellectually dishonest of me to say that experience hasn't had many, many positive influences in my life. It's informed me with sincere compassion and empathy for other people's emotional suffering, which now it's possible perhaps I could have gotten those things without that bereavement, but I don't know. Don't know how. I think it's highly, highly, highly likely that traumatic experience was very, very important to who I am today. Now, if I could live the counterfactual where my father is alive today and he didn't die of cancer in 97, I would. Don't get me wrong, but I think it would be dishonest of me to denigrate the importance of that suffering in my life, and to garner no meaning from that experience would render me unworthy of my suffering. I didn't get any value from it, and it would maybe even render my father's life less useful than it should have been, because if I wasn't going to attain any value or moral values from his death, well, what meaning did his life bring to me in the first place? So that's my second episode on Man's Search for Meaning. If you liked the video, please like it. If you didn't like it, please dislike it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I've shared in the comments. So make sure to comment, and remember, if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. Thank you.